Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because the moment my dad looked me in the eye and said, almost casually, "Give your sister your car, she needs it more than you," something inside me finally clicked, and I realized that if I didn't draw a hard line right then, I would spend the rest of my life being the designated backup plan for everyone else's chaos. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I didn't make a scene. I just nodded slowly, almost like I was agreeing, and whispered, "Maybe don't stress over her too much. She isn't actually your daughter." And the sound of his glass nearly slipping from his hand told me everything I needed to know, that I had just shattered the script that had kept this family running for years. Now, let me back up, because if you don't know the background, you'll think I was being cruel, when really, I was exhausted from years of being told to give up whatever I had, to step aside whenever my sister wanted something, and to act like it was normal that one child's needs always outweighed the others. My name is Lauren, I'm in my early 30s, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one who held things together. When my dad's shop was short on help, it was me pulling unpaid shifts. When Jess needed money for gas, for school, for tickets she never paid, somehow it came out of my pocket. When she wrecked her last car, I was the one who lent mine so she could get back on her feet. Every time, I was told, "You're stronger, you can handle it, just do this one more thing." And I did, until I realized that one more thing was never going to end. So when Dad sat at the table that night and said she needed my car, like it was the most obvious solution in the world, I felt something snap. I could hear my heart pounding, not because I was scared, but because I knew this was the moment I was done playing their game. He didn't even ask politely. He just assumed, like always, that I would hand over the keys and figure out how to live without what I needed. And the worst part? Jess was sitting there smirking, already acting like it was settled, like she'd won before the conversation even started. That smugness told me more than words ever could. She believed she was untouchable, and she had every reason to think so, because Dad had always let her skate by without consequences. I looked at him and thought about all the times I'd paid her fines, about the way my insurance went up because she borrowed my car and got into yet another fender bender, about the money I never saw again after just spotting her this once. And I thought about how every time I tried to bring it up, Dad brushed it off with that same tired line, "She's your sister, she needs you, be supportive." But nobody ever told Jess to be supportive of me. Nobody ever told her to give something up for my sake. And in that silence, I finally understood that this wasn't about fairness or family, it was about me being the safe, reliable option, and her being the fragile one who needed protecting. That setup had kept running smoothly for decades, but it only worked if I kept nodding along. And this time, I didn't. I knew better than to get into a shouting match, because that's what they expected. If I raised my voice, they'd dismiss me as emotional, dramatic, selfish. So I kept my tone quiet, almost calm, and said the one thing I knew would cut straight through the performance: "Maybe don't stress over her too much. She isn't actually your daughter." I didn't elaborate, I didn't explain, I didn't confirm or deny. I just left it there, and the look on his face told me I had hit a nerve so deep he couldn't mask it. He nearly dropped his glass, and Jess went pale, which made me wonder for the first time if she knew more than she let on. I didn't press. I let the silence do the work. Sometimes silence is the loudest weapon you can use. But here's the part you need to understand. My revenge didn't start with that line. It started earlier that week when I went down to the DMV and made sure every trace of my car, title, insurance, liability, was locked down under my name alone. No more loopholes, no more, just add her temporarily, no more excuses. I had learned the hard way that if you leave even a tiny opening, Jess will squeeze through it and Dad will hold the door open. So I shut it all. By the time he asked me to hand over my car, there wasn't even a legal way for them to twist my arm. I didn't argue about what I deserved. I just built the wall ahead of time and let them hit it at full speed. And you know what? That felt better than any screaming match ever could. Because when you stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to stand up for yourself and you quietly take the power back, they don't know what to do with themselves. Jess tried to laugh it off like I was bluffing, but when she realized the insurance was already changed and the mechanic had notes not to release the car without my approval, her smirk slipped. Dad tried to play the authority card, but even he knew that paperwork doesn't bend to guilt trips. And then, when I dropped that single whispered line about her not being his daughter, I saw the entire foundation of their little dynamic crack wide open. I didn't stick around to explain. I stood up, cleared my plate, and walked out before anyone could demand details. Because the point wasn't to drop every truth at once, it was to stop the automatic cycle where they demand and I give. For once, I left them with the confusion instead of carrying it home myself. And as I walked to my car legally, untouchably mine, I realized I wasn't just driving away from dinner. I was driving away from years of being the convenient option, the safety net, the person who always fixed things at her own expense. That night, the balance shifted and none of us could go back. And that's where I'll leave you for now, because the fallout from that one quiet sentence was bigger than I ever imagined. The glass nearly falling was only the beginning. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument we had ever had. What came next didn't just change the family dynamic, it exposed cracks that had been there all along, waiting for someone to stop pretending they weren't. By the next morning, the family group chat had turned into a performance I had seen so many times that I could predict the beats before they landed. With Jess posting a breathless paragraph about how transportation was essential for her job prospects and her appointments, and how cruel it was that I, the person who had everything together, could not make a simple sacrifice for the person who supposedly needed it more, while Dad chimed in with that managerial tone he saves for moments when he believes authority will substitute for logic, reminding everyone that families pull together in hard times and that in our family we do not keep score. Which made me laugh out loud because if there is one thing I have learned from years of unpaid shifts and quietly covered bills, it is that the people who say we do not keep score are always the ones who owe you the most. I typed and erased 3 responses before settling on the one that would move the ball without feeding the drama, a single long message that acknowledged Jess's challenges without adopting any of them as my responsibility, and that explained, in clear and annoyingly adult language, that the car was titled to me alone, that my insurance no longer covered any other driver, that previous incidents had raised my costs and drained my savings, and that while I wished her well and hoped she found a stable solution, I would not be providing a vehicle, a ride, or a cosign, not now and not later, because I had learned the difference between helping and enabling, and I chose the former for myself for the first time in years. Predictably, Jess shifted into the next act of the play, the one where the tone turns soft and a little teary, and I am reminded of how much she has struggled and how often she has felt misunderstood. And if I were still the earlier version of myself, I would have climbed into the gap and tried to fix feelings with money and time, but instead I sent her a code for a rideshare credit that I could afford, a link to the bus schedule that actually runs near her place, and a line that felt like lifting a weight from my chest as I typed it, which was that I loved her and would not be her backup plan anymore. Once the messages stopped pinging, I opened the folder on my laptop that I had built quietly over the past year, not with revenge in mind, but with sanity. A set of spreadsheets and screenshots and calendar entries that spelled out every unpaid hour at Dad's shop, every bank transfer labeled temporary, every Venmo request that got ignored, and every text promising repayment that never arrived. And while I am not a lawyer and do not want to be one, I understand that paper is the only language some people hear, so I assembled a tidy packet the way I wish someone had taught me when I was 20, an itemized invoice with dates and totals that were not exaggerated and not padded, just real and sober and impossible to argue with. And I sent it to Dad's business email with a short, respectful note that I hoped we could settle it amicably within a reasonable time frame. Then I copied Tara, his office manager, and the only person in that building who ever truly saw me, because I wanted the conversation to live where it belonged, in the realm of schedules and accounts rather than guilt and obligation. The reply from Dad landed quickly and came dressed in the language of insulted dignity, asking how I could put a dollar amount on family support and suggesting I take a breath and remember who I was talking to. which might have worked on me in the past when I felt 15 again and desperate to be called a good daughter. But on this day I looked at the total and thought about the rent relief it could have bought, and the dental bill it could have covered, and the way it had never even been named before, and I realized that naming a thing is sometimes the only way to make it stop consuming you. Word travels fast in small communities where image is a currency, and within an afternoon I had 2 texts from women at church framed as concern, but edged with judgment, asking whether I had really sent a bill to my own father and whether there was anything they could do to help me repair the relationship, and I, who have spent so much of my life performing calm so that other people would not feel uncomfortable, took a breath and chose a different tactic, telling them that the best way to help would be to stop assuming the loudest person in a conflict is always right, that adults sometimes need to settle adult matters like adults, and that if they cared for our family, they might consider that accountability and love are not opposites. Dad must have called Jess after he read my note because her tone in the next message went from soft to explosive, accusing me of humiliating him and threatening his reputation at a time when he was up for a role at church that required the appearance of harmony, and it would have been so easy to take that bait, to apologize and withdraw, except I had already promised myself that no decision would be made in panic or shame. So I replied that nothing in my packet would ever be public unless he chose to make it public, and that a repayment plan, even a modest one, would close the loop. Late that evening my phone buzzed with a number I recognized from the shop, and Tara's voice came through in that low, careful register she uses when the truth is about to be heavier than the room can handle. And she said she had seen my email and thought I had been more than fair, and then she paused in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up even without a draft in the room, and she told me there were old folders in a cabinet no one ever opens anymore. Folders from years when the bookkeeping was done by hand and the dates don't match up cleanly, and if I was willing to come by after closing she would show me what she meant, because sometimes paper not only records hours and invoices, it records the stories that people have worked very hard to tell in a different order. I thanked her and said I would be there, and as I hung up I looked at the quiet phone and the mute group chat and the spreadsheet still open on my screen, and I realized that my small, tidy act of revenge, sending a precise invoice and putting the conversation in the right inbox, had just opened a door I had never dared to touch, a door that might lead to answers I had only hinted at with one whispered sentence at dinner. When I walked into the shop after closing time, the air was thick with the smell of oil and dust, and even though I had grown up in that place, sweeping floors and answering phones while Dad fixed cars and Jess drifted in and out without a single obligation, it felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves knew I was about to uncover something that would make the arguments about cars and invoices look like nothing more than smoke hiding a far larger fire. Tara was waiting near the back office with a stack of folders that looked so ordinary anyone else might have ignored them, but the way she held them told me they mattered, and when she laid them out on the desk and flipped them open, the dates and notes immediately jumped out at me, messy handwriting from decades ago, receipts taped crookedly to pages, entries that did not line up with the official timeline of Dad and Mom's separation, and payments that seemed to overlap with months when Jess was supposed to have been conceived. It was the kind of paper trail you would miss if you wanted to believe the family story, but if you stopped pretending, it was as clear as ink on a page, and I felt my throat tighten because suddenly my whispered comment at dinner, the one I had tossed out like a grenade, no longer felt like speculation, but like something I had almost known deep down without admitting it to myself. I sat there with Tara, who kept her voice steady but sympathetic, and we went through page after page, my eyes catching on little details that brought back memories I had filed away without understanding them. Like the stretch of time when Dad lived in a rental across town and Mom avoided talking about it, or the way relatives whispered during holidays when Jess was a baby, or the reason why whenever the topic of birth years came up Mom would change the subject with that careful, tight smile. None of it was proof in the sense of a courtroom, but combined with what Tara showed me, it was enough to make me stop doubting myself, and for the first time I admitted silently that the story our family had been running on for years was not the truth. I felt a surge of anger, Not just at Dad or Mom or Jess, but at the whole machine of silence that had trained me to believe my job was to cover gaps, to hand over whatever I had, to play the good daughter while pieces of the real story sat in a cabinet waiting to be discovered by accident. That night I drove to Mom's house, because if I was going to carry this, I needed to hear it from her, and when I asked gently about those months, about the dates that did not add up, she went very still. Her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if it could keep her steady, and finally she whispered that she had wanted to tell the truth many times, but every time she thought about it she pictured our family shattering, Dad leaving for good. Just growing up with a hole where a father should be. And me caught in the crossfire, so she told herself silence was protection, even though in reality it only built a lie so large it consumed everything around it. I did not scream at her, I did not call her names, because what was the point? But I did tell her clearly that the silence had never protected me, it had only ensured that I became the one carrying burdens that were never mine to carry. She cried, not loudly but in that quiet way that feels like the body giving up resistance, and she asked me what I was going to do now. And here's the part that matters. I decided I was going to do it the right way, because revenge that feels good for a second but collapses under scrutiny is nothing but self-sabotage, and I wanted something clean, undeniable, and lasting. I did not steal documents or wave papers around at dinner. Instead, I requested the records that were legally mine to request. I documented every piece of labor I had done for the shop, and I filed a small claims action for the exact amount I was owed. Nothing more and nothing less, because I wanted this to live where it belonged, in systems, not in screaming matches. When the official envelope landed on Dad's desk, I know it must have hit him harder than any argument I could have made, because he called me late that night, his voice strained, asking why I was doing this to him. And I told him as calmly as I could that I was not doing anything to him, I was simply making sure the work I had done was recognized, because asking nicely had never worked. And if he hated the envelope, he should remember that it existed only because he ignored every request I had ever made quietly. In that moment I felt something shift, because I had turned the endless, circular fight about loyalty and sacrifice into a matter of dates and signatures. And there is nothing people like my father hate more than being forced to deal with reality on paper instead of reshaping it through guilt. For years, he had counted on my silence and my willingness to smooth things over, but once the process began in an official setting, he could not charm or scold his way out of it. And while he might have told himself I was being ungrateful or vindictive, the truth was that I was setting the same boundaries any employer, any bank, any landlord would set without hesitation, and if it felt like betrayal. Maybe that was because he had confused my role as a daughter with the role of someone who existed only to absorb consequences he wanted to avoid. I ended that night lying awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the whispered line I had thrown at him during dinner was no longer just a provocation, but a shadow of a truth that paper was beginning to confirm. And I knew the story was about to expand beyond invoices and claims into territory that would touch every corner of who we thought we were as a family. The shop folders had cracked open the door, Mom's confession had pushed it wider, and now the envelope with my claim had placed the first undeniable mark on the record. The next steps were no longer about whether I could win an argument or keep my car. They were about what happens when silence is no longer enough to keep the story intact. And as much as part of me feared the fallout, another part of me felt stronger than I ever had, because I had proof, I had patience, and I had no intention of backing down. By the time word of the small claims filing spread beyond our immediate family, I realized how quickly reputations can become currency in a community where everyone knows each other, because suddenly my father, who had always been so proud of presenting himself as a man of stability, fairness, and traditional family values, was scrambling to maintain the image of harmony that he needed in order to secure a nomination for a prominent church committee. And in his mind, my actions were not about debt or fairness or truth, but about betrayal, as though the very act of pulling the curtain back on what had been going on for years was more offensive than the actions that had forced me to do it in the first place. I found myself at the center of whispered conversations, receiving sideways glances from people who thought they were subtle, hearing through mutual acquaintances that it was such a shame I had gone too far, as if asking to be compensated for hundreds of hours of unpaid labor and drawing a clear boundary about being exploited by my sister somehow made me the villain. I will admit that for a few days, that chorus of judgment almost wore me down, because there is a unique kind of exhaustion that comes from standing alone against a family narrative that has been rehearsed for decades, especially when others repeat it without even realizing how false it is. But then I reminded myself of something I had learned the hard way. People who care more about appearances than substance will always call the truth an attack, and if I gave in to that framing, I would spend the rest of my life apologizing for speaking up. So instead of backing down, I pushed forward with precision, because precision is what people like my father cannot dismiss. I invited both him and my mother to sit down at a neutral office space with a mediator present, not because I thought he would welcome it, but because I knew that when someone else was in the room, he could not twist the conversation into another guilt-laden lecture about loyalty and sacrifice. On the day of the meeting, he walked in with that stiff posture that told me he intended to dominate the room, while my mother looked small and resigned, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and I simply waited, letting him perform his monologue about how I was tearing the family apart, how community standing mattered, how everyone was already watching us and wondering what had gone wrong, and when he finally paused for breath, I reached into my folder and slid across the table a packet that contained 3 simple things: the signed and notarized documentation of my hours and compensation owed, a clear repayment plan broken into manageable installments that he could not call unfair because it was modest to the point of being generous, and a sealed envelope that contained information he had avoided for decades, information he could choose to open or ignore, but could no longer deny existed. I did not raise my voice, I did not explain the contents in detail, and I did not threaten to reveal them. I simply placed them on the table and told him, calmly, that whether he opened them or not, the truth would sit there, waiting, no longer hidden in dusty folders or whispered suspicions. The moment stretched long, and he tried to pivot again into rhetoric, claiming that if his nomination fell through it would be on me, not on anything that happened decades ago, and I met his eyes and reminded him that he had not opened a single envelope yet. So the only damage done so far was the damage of his own fear. I could see the calculation running through his head, weighing his desire to keep control against the undeniable fact that the rules of the game had changed, because for once I was not reacting emotionally, not trying to win love or approval, but holding documents that did not care about opinion or reputation. Eventually, he signed the acknowledgement of my hours and repayment, his signature shaky but official, and I withdrew the claim the same day. Not because he deserved my leniency, but because I wanted the copy of that signed paper more than I wanted to sit in court, since that single page now carried more weight than a dozen arguments ever could. Walking out of that office, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had played a long game without even knowing it, because every time I had written down a shift, every time I had saved a receipt, every time I had noted a transfer, I was building the foundation of a case I did not know I would need, and now it was my father who was cornered, not by anger but by paper. My sister, of course, was furious, sending me a stream of messages about betrayal, about humiliation, about how I was making her life harder, as if my refusal to be her endless provider was cruelty rather than simple fairness. But I ignored them, because the truth was that she had grown used to a world where Dad and I bent the rules to cushion her, and now that world was collapsing, she did not know how to function without it. Still, the sealed envelope remained in his possession, unopened, sitting like a silent bomb on his desk, and when I thought about it late at night, I realized that it did not matter whether he opened it in a week or a year or never at all. Because the important part was that the choice was no longer his alone, it was shared, it was acknowledged, and it was no longer invisible. And that knowledge, that shift of control, was in itself a kind of revenge, not loud or dramatic, but subtle and permanent. As I left the office building that day, the cool air outside felt sharper than it had in years, and I knew that while the family story had not yet shattered, The cracks were visible now to anyone who looked closely. The people who thought they knew us would go on whispering, my father would go on pretending, Jess would go on playing her part, but none of them could erase the fact that the truth now lived in envelopes, signatures, and documents that carried more authority than their judgments. And I could feel, deep in my chest, that the final confrontation was coming, the one where no amount of silence or reputation management would be enough to hold the old story together. When my father finally called to suggest we have dinner just the two of us, no audience and no group chat echoing in the background, I agreed, not because I believed he was ready to meet me in the middle, but because I wanted to end this story in a place where the words would have to stand on their own without a chorus of rescuers. And as I sat across from him watching the familiar way he squared his shoulders before launching into a speech about unity and legacy and how families survive storms. By choosing not to make them bigger, I felt that odd mixture of sadness and relief that arrives when you recognize a pattern with enough clarity to stop being pulled into it. Since everything about his tone said he hoped I would fold to protect his image one more time, while everything about my posture said I was done being the stabilizing force that kept his world tidy at the cost of my own peace. He started with a summary of the past few weeks that framed my actions as a misunderstanding fueled by stress. He described the repayment plan he had signed as evidence of his goodwill rather than the paper reality it represented, and he mentioned his church nomination in a way that dripped with implication. As though I should volunteer to become the quiet daughter again because it would be a shame to let community influence slip after so many years of effort, and while the younger version of me would have softened, I instead waited for him to finish and then told him, in one long breath that felt like exhaling a lifetime of swallowed words, that I had not blown up a family so much as refused to be its unpaid shock absorber any longer, that no public role justified private exploitation, and that every choice I had made had been measured, documented, and intentionally boring because boring is what holds up when the dust settles. He looked annoyed by my tone yet strangely unsettled by my calm, so he pivoted into the soft threat I knew was coming, asking what I imagined people would say if rumors kept spreading. What I imagined Jess would do if she lost the fragile stability she had managed to assemble, and what I imagined would happen if he decided the envelopes and signatures and careful processes were an attack he no longer had to tolerate. And while there was a time when those questions would have sent me backpedaling into apologies and compromises, I told him, without raising my voice, that people would say whatever made them feel safe, and that it was not my job to curate their comfort. That Jess was an adult whose life could not continue to be financed by my guilt, and that envelopes and signatures were only intolerable to people who benefit from things remaining unspoken, which is a category I was no longer willing to inhabit. He tried to play the father card, that blend of authority and disappointment. That had worked on me for decades, and I felt a flicker of pain because I still loved parts of him, the parts that taught me to be exacting with tools and careful with my word. Yet that love no longer required that I hand over my autonomy in exchange for the privilege of sitting at his table. So I reached into my bag and placed 2 documents between us with a simplicity that cut through the performance more effectively than any argument could have done. The first document was my final boundary in writing, a notarized letter that laid out, in plain language that would hold up anywhere, that I would not co-sign loans, would not attach my insurance to any driver who is not me, would not transfer a vehicle title without compensation and legal counsel, would not front money for tickets or repairs or emergencies that arrived dressed as emergencies, but were actually the result of choices, and would not perform labor at the shop without an agreed rate and assigned timesheet, and he frowned at the formality as if paperwork between family was somehow vulgar, while I reminded him that informality had been the camouflage that enabled a long list of imbalances, which meant that formality was not aggression but an equalizer. The second document, sealed like the earlier one he had refused to open, was a copy of my mother's notarized statement that did not narrate every detail but established what mattered in legal terms, which was that there were facts about paternity that did not match the family story, and I told him that I was not there to force a revelation or to humiliate anyone, that I would not parade this letter through any forum or feed it to any rumor mill, and that the choice to open it remained his, Yet the era of pretending there was nothing to open had ended for good. He stared at the envelopes in a way that made the room feel smaller, and he reached for his glass with that same distracted grip I had seen the night I first delivered the line that fractured his certainty. And I watched the calculation cross his face as he weighed community standing against private truth, and for a long moment I said nothing because silence, when used without panic, can be the cleanest tool you possess. Then he muttered that he wanted simple. He wanted the past to stay in the past. He wanted us to move forward for the sake of appearances, and I told him that simple had been expensive and that the past had not stayed in the past because it had been living rent-free inside my decisions for years. And that moving forward was not the same as reverting, since moving forward for me meant a future in which the cost of keeping the peace was no longer automatically billed to me. He asked, almost like a child trying to negotiate curfew, what he was supposed to tell people if they asked why the nomination stalled or why Jess was suddenly facing the consequences of her own choices, and I told him he could say the truest sentence available, which was that his older daughter finally decided to stop covering the spread, that she asked to be paid for work performed, that she withdrew from an economic arrangement that had never been acknowledged, and that she placed the truth within reach without dragging anyone by the hair toward it. I paid my share of the check even though he tried to wave his hand like money was the least of our concerns, because symbolism matters, and when I stood to leave I added one last thing. Not as a threat or a dare, but as a statement of the new terms under which I would live, which was that whether he opened the envelope tomorrow, or in 10 years, or never at all, I would no longer be the person who turned herself into raw material to keep other people's stories intact, that I wished him well, that I did not intend to cut him out so much as define the edges through which we would interact, and that if he chose to be angry, I could survive that better than I could survive drowning in a role that was killing me by inches. He lifted the glass, the rim clicking softly against the table, and the smallest shake of his hand told me that despite all his speeches about strength and order, this conversation had reached a place he could not dominate, and as I walked away, I felt the particular lightness that follows a decision made without theatrics, a quiet, anchored certainty that whatever came next would not be controlled by guilt or rumor or public posture, but by the fact that I had executed a plan with patience and clarity, that I had left the truth within reach, and that I had closed, one by one, every door through which my time, money, and sanity used to leak, which meant that, even if their script staggered on for a while, the power to keep it running no longer lived with me. And that was the win I had been chasing without knowing it for years.